Welcome to Social Evolution, the podcast where we talk about the future of humanity. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michael Porcelli.
I'm Max Borders.
And today we are going to be talking about consciousness. So, Max, what comes to mind when I think of consciousness? It's an interesting topic, but I sort of wonder, why are we talking about that in the context of social evolution? Like, why does that matter for this particular podcast and what we're into here? What do you got to say about that?
For me, and I hope you agree, and look, I don't think this will be an episode dedicated to AI. I think we should definitely do an AI episode, artificial intelligence. But this episode in particular, why consciousness? There is this idea of the technological singularity, right? We're programming computers to be more like humans in some way. And in fact, with artificial intelligence, the idea is that someday computers will be as intelligent as human beings. And on some dimensions, they already are more intelligent. They're faster. They can do more computations in certain narrow spheres. But at the end of the day, on a lot of different dimensions, the idea is that they're going to catch up with human beings. Well, what does that mean that they're going to catch up from just data processing or not access to knowledge or whatever? There's just so many dimensions there, but one in particular has to be human consciousness. So the idea that one day under the technological singularity, the humans will wake up or gain sentient. I'm sorry, the computers will wake up. The machines will wake up. It prompts us to ask a series of questions about human beings. If they're waking up, what does it mean for a human to be awake, as it were? What does it mean for a human being to be conscious? And I think that there is a more intimate connection between consciousness, particularly on what we'll discuss, which is phenomenal consciousness. Okay. And I'll explain that in just a moment. That connection between phenomenal consciousness and thought, or executing certain kinds of algorithms to get a certain kind of result. If you want to use the language of computer science with reference to thought, that may or may not be appropriate. So there's a whole suite of questions here, but some of them, at least most of them, connect back to this question of what does it mean to be conscious? And what does consciousness mean? What is it?
Yeah. I think what's cool about what you're saying is it sort of reminds me of, science fiction themes and people who think about the future or where we could be going. There's a little bit of an element of almost like prophecy or prognostication in that literature. And also, in recent decades, especially, folks like Ray Kurzweil talking about the technological singularity. And you, Max, you got a book called The Social Singularity, where in some sense, trying to not do sci-fi, but actually start to anticipate what's coming. And what's kind of cool about these stories or these speculations about the future, is they naturally entail philosophical questions that actually stretch all the way back to, age-old, perennial things that the philosophers have talked about for a very long time. And it sort of makes sense in a way that these things are connected, right? Like, what's the nature of right and wrong, or good and evil, or morality, or ethics? And if we're going to be building this fancy civilization of the future, we're going to be building robots. Well, what are the ethical implications of that? And I know in my computer science department, we talked about, what does it mean to, computer ethics and social issues? So it does come down to social issues, and one of those aspects is, we're humans. We've got consciousness, or at least we think we do, and we've got minds, and we've got intelligence, and I think I want to maybe kind of throw in a few things that come up for me when we think about that, and maybe then we zoom in specifically on, phenomenal consciousness and kind of the philosophical matter at hand. But but I think if I think of like the thing you talked about, like, oh, what if robots or AIs become conscious just by virtue of the fact that they're achieving some complexity or sophistication or intelligence? And I think there's a differentiation between intelligence and consciousness, but oftentimes those questions arise together. And it actually arises when we reflect on ourselves, and when philosophers, from ages previous were thinking about what it means to be conscious and thinking about the behavior of like animals or something. Are they conscious too? Do they have a lesser degree of consciousness? And there's almost like, do they have a lesser degree of intelligence? Is it the same kind of intelligence that we have? And then when I think into the future, not only do I wonder if robots and AI programs will become conscious, but like, what is it that we could build as our, social fabric of the future, where we maybe upload our brains or our minds like in the Matrix, or we're connected to some network and some super immersive artificial environment. Like, how will we be conscious in those environments? How important is it that we remain conscious? If we stopped being conscious in those environments, does something super important like disappear? Is it even possible for consciousness to disappear in that way? I don't know, but these are like what could happen if we build these future things, right?
I can't get across how difficult it is to appreciate even asking those questions. Okay. For example, when you say, will we become less conscious or unconscious, or is maybe not us, but these extensions of ourselves that we built or at least taught to self-replicate in some way and learn to self-create. Mm-hmm. Maybe there is some intimate metaphysical connection between the neuromorphology of being a human being and because it instantiates these set of causal physical relationships, and those, in some deep metaphysical sense, track with what we would call conscious properties or phenomenal properties. That is a hard thing right there to first distinguish in people's minds. Because when you say would suddenly become unconscious, you might just imagine being hit over the head with a mallet and suddenly becoming unconscious and therefore not dead, but just not awake in the sense of being, having some experience, the kind of technicolor world that we have from the time we wake up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night, and everything in between, right? So the subtlety of this conversation, it just requires a lot of unpacking to get what we mean when we say these things. So, whether or not we'll get to the idea of, a conscious universe or not in this episode,
I hope we do,
depends on whether or not, you and I, between us, can fully begin to appreciate both the mysteries in these questions, but also just parsing them in a way that we don't lose the concepts. And that's a really hard thing to do.
It is. I'm excited to get into it. This might be a little bit more academic, or a little bit more even like Max and Porch share about their understanding of like, the philosophy of mind and consciousness studies and these sorts of things. And I think it was fun to discover, back in the late 90s, you were off in your world and I was in my world, and you were in a philosophy department and I was in a philosophy department, and like, but there was a thing that was happening, which was like kind of a hot topic of that time, philosophy of mind, and, authors like Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers and Paul and Patricia Churchland and other people were really in this discussion of like, what does it mean? What is it? Like, what is consciousness? And how can we talk about it as a, an object of inquiry, or maybe not an object, but a topic of inquiry of some kind. And
yes,
and that's what we're going to try to do here today, exploring that.
Why does that matter, though? I mean, this is one of the things that you're really trying to get out of me since the beginning here. Why does that matter? It's like, if this was a hot topic back in the 90s and 2000s, and it's enjoying a resurgence, surely because it's a lagging indicator behind
Yeah.
all this interest in artificial intelligence. So it's suddenly here again.
Yeah.
There's these philosophers going, whoa, 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 you're getting ahead of yourselves, guys.
Right.
You're being too reductionist. You're just because you understand some sort of causal physical processes by virtue of neuroscience or through investigations of microphysics or, Gödel's theorems or whatever. I mean, you can throw math at this problem. You can throw all manner of physics and, just neurophysiology in general. But that is, to philosophers, a bit dancing around the subject, dancing around the mystery, perhaps getting closer to the core of the mystery. And some philosophers would say, oh, yeah, we don't need to get closer to the core. We've already laid it bare. Others are saying, wow, but no, but what about all these other intuitions that you are not explaining through your mechanization or application of physics or science, hyperscience, objective hyperscience. And that's what we want to really pull philosophy back into the conversation.
Yep. Let's do it. I mean, what I'm getting in terms of like what matters, and I think we got to like put a pin in what matters and why we're talking about it and then get into it. But I do think what I'm hearing and what you're saying, to paraphrase or sum it up, is something like it needs to matter because we're kind of fussing with our own biology and our own future in these ways without maybe fully understanding what we're fussing with. And so there's some kind of risk, or maybe there's some kind of primordial fear or something that if we, like you're saying, reductionism or mathematization or computer upload something, we might lose or miss out on some important feature that is represented by this kind of core concept in the philosophy of mind, this idea of the phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah, which is the totality of our waking existence.
Yeah. So say more.
I mean, it is entirely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's drop back for a moment and make sure that we have appreciation of the distinction between subjective and objective, for example.
Sure.
Some linguists and philosophers of language, some other kinds of philosophers seek to reconcile the objective with the subjective in interesting ways. That's another deep level of inquiry in the philosophy of language or the philosophy of knowledge, which is called epistemology. But just to acknowledge for a moment that there are different kinds of properties. On the one hand, we might intuitively call them subjective and objective properties. Okay. Another way we might describe those in the overlapping domains would be conscious properties or mental properties on the one hand, and physical causal properties on the other. Okay. So let me give you just a little baby steps example of this. Okay. Imagine you wake up in the morning and and your mama's visiting you. Okay. And the first thing you notice when you wake up is the smell of coffee and the smell of bacon. Two of my favorite scents, by the way. Okay. And wow. So I get up and I wander into the kitchen, and of course you want to say thank you to Mama because she got up first and did all that cooking. But pretty much the first thing I do after thanking Mama is get a fresh cup of coffee, hold it up to my nose, and grab a strip of that bacon, even before I'm able to load my plate with all the other things that might be there, like grits or eggs or whatever. Now, that was me engaging in certain kinds of behavior. And throughout most of the 20th century, when you would talk about that process, it was in very what we might call reductionist terms. Okay. We would talk about, we would refer to consciousness, this stuff we take for granted. And I just said stuff, but forgive me for a moment. This something we call consciousness, we just took for granted, right? So we might describe we might have some understanding of atoms and molecules. And of course, atoms and molecules rise from the steaming cup of coffee. And so also do molecules of bacon. And they strike the mucous lining of your nose, which has nerve endings that send certain kinds of signals to your brain.
Yep.
And that activates centers in your brain that were evolved over millions of years. And the circuitry fires in a certain pattern that is recognizable because it taps into certain memory banks about that you might find in a schema that we would call baconness or coffeeness. Okay.
Yeah.
But there is in that moment this causal physical story. Okay. Oh, and by the way, that neurological firing that corresponds, by the way, with this set of sensations that we've just ignored up to this point, causes you to have certain kinds of behavior in stimulus response fashion. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the response is the behavior. It just is the behavior. You know, what happens next is just that I grab for the cup of coffee or I grab a strip of bacon, right?
Yep.
But so I just told, let's imagine also that I'm a really, really intelligent scientist, and and the neurophysiology is completely known to me. So also is the microphysics of coffee molecules and all that shit. Okay. I can tell you pretty much a complete causal story from the behavior of grabbing that piece of bacon all the way back in time through my neurophysiology, through my nerve cells in the body, you know, in my arm and all this stuff, backwards causation, trace that causal chain back to, lying in the bed and having those molecules strike the lining of my nose, right? Yeah. So between that behavior and that experience is a causal story that seems to me to be relatively complete, and especially causally complete. That is to say, if we think of ourselves as physical beings in a physical universe, the causal story is complete enough that we don't need all this other shit for that to have happened, namely the bacon grabbing behavior. Mm-hmm. Okay? And yet we have this stuff that is the totality of our existence, which is the totality of our experienced existence, is what I mean to say. Yeah. Because existence isn't happening for us when we're unconscious or we're dead. Yeah. Okay. So on our waking lives, we have this technicolor set of experiences that is the redness of red, the smelly, the experiential smell of bacon, not molecules striking the lining of your nose, but closing your eyes and imagining bacon smell right now. When I say it, it just happens. Your mouth starts to water unless you're of a religious persuasion that proscribes pork, right? Whatever it is you like to eat, put that into the X. Yep. But the idea here is we've got this causal story, the neurophysiology, we know more and more about that with each passing day. And yet we have all of this technicolor that it in some sense accompanies or mediates, or we don't know what its nature is, but it is all encompassing, and it is our phenomenal consciousness. It is our experience at every moment. Yep. And those are two different kinds of stories. And we want to know how they reconcile, if they reconcile, what is the nature of their intimacy from a metaphysical standpoint, and science and dancing around these questions of science seems to leave us with a gap, a major gap, an explanatory gap on the relationship between those two very different kinds of properties. And if you don't think they're very different kinds of properties, we can go into more why they are.
Yes, or at least more of why some people think they are, because some people would challenge that idea. But I think what you said was a great account, and I'll sum it up in kind of maybe my version of it here. Well, one thing you did not say is the phrase "what it is like," which I like as a phrase. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a story of what it's like to feel it, what it's like to experience it, what it's like to be there, what it's like to have it, do it, whatever this is pointing to the phenomenal aspect, the phenomenal consciousness aspect. And I think the issue that has puzzled philosophers forever is this idea that, like, well, we could explain in these causal terms as much as we wanted, like a lot. And we could give a full account without ever having to invoke something like consciousness, like what it was like. But if we did that, it would still feel like there's some hugely important thing that's missing, which is like the entire experience of what it's like to be there while it's happening. And that is the explanatory gap, right? Like
Yes.
a totally causally closed account, whatever sort of layer of psychology or physics or, quantum physics or whatever, general relativity you get into, right? Like
it seems to dance around the mystery.
Yeah.
Well, let's go for a moment to the most sophisticated computer programs, okay? In these high-powered processors sitting on servers somewhere executing a program. Okay? When that happens, there's a certain set of relationships, inputs into the processors. Now, all the sophisticated events that happen, causal physical events that happen, that can be understood at the software layer through code, and also at the hardware layer through the processing that is required to execute the code. Okay?
Right.
All of these causal stories are also complete. What if we were to ask, what is it like for that computer to have executed that code? Right?
It's a cool question.
And I think the answer intuitively for us is, well, it's not like anything. Most people would say, well, it's just not like anything. It's just a machine doing its thing. It's like a wind-up toy. You know, if you have a wind-up toy, it's just a way more sophisticated wind-up toy with transducers and code and this and that. But at the end of the day, it's instantiating through a machine some causal physical process to get a certain result. That is executing the algorithm.
Yep.
And yet people who see human beings as embodied, as evolved, as living in a physical universe, also can tell some sort of causal story about executing something that's causal physical, however different it may be. Okay? So when we think about what it's like and try to appreciate that, there's an old story from Frank Jackson, who was an Australian philosopher. He's known for the story of Mary, and the basic idea. This is one of my favorites. I like your "What is it like?" That's a great Thomas Nagel example. What is it like to be a bat? You know, he sets his up not by asking what is it like to execute a program, because that seems pretty obvious that's just sophisticated wind-up toys that humans have made. Those aren't alive. Those aren't sentient or conscious, at least not yet. We don't think. But a bat. Now, a bat is sufficiently like a human. You know, it's still got a head and a brain and a body and
a mammal
and sensations, and it's a mammal. It makes noises and it seems to care for its young and all this other stuff. And yet it makes all of these funny shrieks, and some of them are out of the range of our ability even to perceive it, like dog whistle ranges, that sort of stuff. So the bat makes all of these chirps and noises, and we refer to that as echolocation. The echolocation abilities that bats have sends sound waves out into the world to reverberate off objects, perhaps a juicy moth, to come back, and that has a certain level of resolution in the bat's brain that if we had echolocation in an evolved bat brain were sort of spliced into our bodies, we might also be able to know, quote, what it's like to be a bat, right? So I love that example too. It's like it must seem really cool. Like when I look at my computer screen and I see a picture of Michael Porcelli nodding his head approvingly, I hope. Then I can describe this what it's like process. I can describe the process on the one hand, and I can describe the experience on the other. But this is all something that's going on like an inner movie for me that no one else can have. But if
Yep.
it's a physical causal experience, right? If the world is physical and we are embodied in a physical universe, just like machines, just like computers, robots, people too, what is this extra phenomenon that
Right.
is this warm, fuzzy, what its likeness
Yeah.
that accompanies all these processes for people when they perceive or they represent the world. So Frank Jackson, really quickly, and to try to put a really quite fine a point on this. Okay, I don't think that's too risky.
Yeah.
Frank Jackson uses the idea of this neuroscientist named Mary, who's the most fantastically smart neuroscientist you can imagine. In fact, she's so damn smart. She's won all the MacArthur Genius Awards. She's won the Nobel Prize. She's won it all. And that's because she's the most intelligent human being that's ever been on the face of the planet and has read all the damn books. But the whole time she's been doing her research and learning as she has, Mary has been living in a black and white room. Okay, that means all of the buttons and the dials, and she's clothed in black and white and whatever. Let's just,
Yep.
there's some weird aspects of this story from the standpoint of being an intuition pump. But just for a moment, we're in this room that's black and white. Everything she sees is in black and white. The books she reads have, white paper and black type. She learns all about the microphysical processes in the brain. She learns about all of the, ideas about atoms and molecules, all of this good stuff. Being this highly sophisticated scientist, she learns in black and white.
Right.
In a black and white
room.
room.
She learns about eyeballs and the visual cortex, and she learns about all the different rod cone types and the retina.
Cones and rods.
She knows all about color in a theoretical way.
Right. About the way light waves of a certain frequency appear to certain human subjects in certain ways that make them say red or make them say blue. If it's higher frequency, they'll say blue.
Right.
If it's lower frequency, they'll say red. She understands all these phenomena. In fact, she understands them better than you and I or anyone else in the whole wide world.
Right.
And yet one day someone finally comes to the room and knocks at the door. And it's Michael Porcelli. He's got a big smile on his face, and he's holding in his hand a red Macintosh apple.
Yeah.
Which he presents to Mary for the first time. And Mary, and I'm going to put my spin on the story, Mary weeps like these little kids, and these are my favorite videos to watch on YouTube, like these little kids getting cochlear implants for the first time.
Yeah.
Or outfitted with special glasses for the first time because they have certain problems with their retinae.
Yeah.
I mean, she weeps because she has learned something new. And if she's learned something new, what is the nature of that thing that she's learned new? It's redness. It is the what it's like quality of that Macintosh apple.
Yeah.
And in that novelty, she thought she knew everything there was to know, and the causal physical processes would cover it. But indeed, she has learned something quite novel. And it's really difficult to deny that she has been introduced to a property that she didn't know before, because it was the experience. It was that what it is like that she now apprehends that is separate from that entire causal story.
Yep. Totally. These are fairly modern takes, and I like, you bringing in the what it's like to be a bat and Mary the color scientist. These are classics in the philosophy of mind literature to trying to create in the listener this idea that like, oh, there is a gap. There's an explanatory gap. There's many ways to point. If you go back to more ancient philosophers, I mean, it was just like the mind body problem, and this idea of like dualism, and Descartes kind of had this kind of interaction through the pineal gland or something like this, right? There's like the body is interacting with a soul, and the soul is sort of like, I don't know, tacked on or something in some kind of metaphysical space to the central part of your brain, or like people trying to make sense in one way or another, like how do we bridge this gap? Because it does sort of seem like this subjective dimension or this experiential dimension is somehow different or distinct from these causal explanations of physical properties and mechanisms and so forth. Yeah.
Well,
I
I mean,
want to go ahead.
yeah, I mean, no, I imagine the listeners right now, like I am, listening to your sort of, sexy California radio voice, right? And that your voice has a certain timbre, and you have a
Mhm.
certain, melody to the way you speak your sentences, right? So do I. It's different,
Mhm.
but the way we regard when we close our eyes and listening to this very podcast, that experiential that experiential aspect of the sound of our voices is a very different kind of property than talking about sound waves being emitted in your earphones or your headphones.
Right.
It's just a different species of knowledge. So we want to be able to understand the mechanism that connects those two, because I don't think anybody denies that there is a deep, deep intimacy between the experience of hearing our voices and
Yep.
that causal physical story. That metaphysical intimacy is also hard to deny. And when
Yep.
I say metaphysical, I'm not talking about woo-woo stuff.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the nature of reality.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so those, if when I say the nature of reality, I'm talking about things that are real.
Yeah.
Something that is real. Is it not real? The sound of my voice in your mind right now, is that not real?
Right. It would be hard to deny this experiential dimension at all. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like if there's anything that I have ever thought or believed or come to know or understand, even about physical properties, like, I learned about atoms in science class or whatever it was that I thought that I learned about the physical world, I couldn't have learned that except through the fact that, like, I heard somebody say something, or I watched something, or looked at something, or read a book or something like this. Like, at some point, all of the things that I think I know about this physical world out there had to kind of like come through this window, metaphorically speaking, of my phenomenal conscious experience. And so, in a certain way, everything that I think I know about a physical world out there, or even causal mechanisms themselves, has come through and been filtered through this window of phenomenal consciousness at one point or another, like creating the knowledge in my mind through interacting with the outside world.
The way you're talking about it right now. So,
Yeah.
so consider what you just said. You said this window of phenomenal consciousness, right?
Right.
I'm imagining that there's an inner movie, like a TV in your head playing. Or when you say a window, maybe it's a TV screen in your mind, the inner film, as it were.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're driving at when you say that?
Kind of. I mean, the idea of the Cartesian theater, or like that there's some kind of way that it presents. I mean, sure. I mean, I want to start poking holes in these ideas, but yeah, I'm just really more saying something about knowledge, like to the degree that I think that I have knowledge about a physical world or causal mechanisms in the physical world, like atoms and energy and molecules and matter. Like, I learned that at some point. And when I learned it through my phenomenal consciousness, right? In a way, it was like words somebody was saying, or words I was reading, or diagrams I was looking at, or something like that. Like, all of my knowledge of the physical world passes through my phenomenal consciousness.
So you have a window metaphor, you have a through, you use the word through, which is, I guess, a preposition of some sort. And it's like you're actually describing consciousness, which is everything to you, as being a medium. Yeah. Is that even appropriate? Right? Like
it seems like it sometimes.
It seems like it. The way we talk about consciousness, certainly the way you're talking about consciousness right now, is that it mediates to some degree between the world and something, which let's call that the I, the ego, the inner homunculus, that is experiencing all this stuff, or being fed this thing. But it's almost like there's to talk about that way separates it out, which is beneficial in some ways to talk about two separate kinds of properties. But in another way, it's almost like, why is why is consciousness this? Why do we consider it a medium? It's almost as if it seems indispensable in some way. Okay. But when we talk about the world in causal physical terms, that ought to be enough, right?
Depends. I mean, I want to push this to the extreme. Yes. Yeah. I want to push it. I'm going to push it way over to one end. I'm going to push it way over to the other end. Because if we keep going in this medium or essential or like what it is like, it seems like that's obvious. You can go all the way to, there's a tradition in Western philosophy called Idealism. And then, in Eastern philosophy, it pops up a lot of time where they kind of take these arguments to the extreme and say, like, actually, the world of matter and energy and physical causation, that isn't real, right? The real thing is simply consciousness and its properties.
Like Berkeleyan simulation theory or something.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Bishop
Berkeley
Berkeley
Bishop Berkeley was the English idealist. But there's a lot in the continental tradition about idealism, and this sort of pushes it in a weird way that is really foreign to a lot of the modern mind, right? The modern mind either thinks of it like as all physical shit or as this kind of like portal, right? There's like a outside world and an inside world, and there's some interaction between them, or there's some passage through them, like this medium or a Cartesian theater or something like this. But if you follow the idealism, which they kind of did, I mean, Descartes sort of did this interactionism thing, and the empiricists sort of like went, nah, screw that, we're just going to talk about physical shit, right? But then in Northern Europe, those philosophers went with the idealism shit, like, and they took it really far, and they were like, what if it's all just projections of mind of some kind, right? Like, things are not even, that's the whole stupid philosophy. If a tree falls in the forest and there's nowhere to hear, it doesn't make a sound. And it's sort of like, that was a serious question, right? No, it doesn't, because there's no perceiver, right? Like,
yes.
These kind of idealism versions of philosophy, which are sort of like the consciousness or the awareness or the mind is the primary thing, and everything else that we think of as physical is really just inside of the mind.
Right. And there's the container metaphor of inside the mind, even though there's this continuity with the rest of the universe that's in many respects undeniable. We think of thoughts as being behind that window of experience, that window of consciousness, and the outside world as being in front of it. And yet we also think in some respects that going back to this idea of consciousness being indispensable, intuitively, I want to ask you this question, and I present this to the listeners as well. Imagine there's this big pile of rocks and dirt or something, and there's a sufficiently advanced nanotechnology, nanomanufacturing technology that allows you to take that big pile of dirt and manure, whatever, anything you want, sand, okay, and reproduce down to the last microphysical detail. And I mean the last microphysical detail. Mary would be able to tell you how to do that. Now, this, by the way, is not an emulation like Robert Hansen is talking about. And I have some issues with the neuromorphology of software uploads as the idea of consciousness. And you and I may argue about this, but let's say we have the neuromorphology completely replicated down to the last microphysical detail because this machine does something out of Star Trek, which is scan the human and do an exact duplicate of it. And now it's going to be situated differently in space and time, but otherwise, in that moment, there is an exact microphysical duplicate twin of you. Okay, we're going to call Michael Prime. Okay, so it's Michael and Michael Prime, and now you're standing next to your microphysical twin. We intuitively think, well, let me ask you, is Michael Prime conscious or not?
I think so, yeah.
I think Michael Prime is conscious too.
Yeah.
But what we have done there again is said, okay, now we're saying that with microphysical duplication, in other words, if we replicate the causal story exactly, consciousness will somehow come along for the ride.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what is the nature of that coming along for the ride? What is the nature of that intimacy between those mental properties on the one hand and the physical properties of the other? And if you don't think that they're mysterious, consider the last time you had a pain in your arm. Okay, and if you go to the doctor, they're going to point to your arm. They're going to put local anesthetic on your arm and all this stuff. And this idea that there's pain in your arm. But if pain is an objective physical phenomenon, why can't you cut open your arm and find the pain?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if pain is some objective physical stuff, the pain ought to be in your arm. Okay, well, it's more sophisticated neuroscience and philosophers will say, well, that's just a category error. Right? You don't need to worry about pain being in your arm because we understand the physical processes of sending nerve signals to your brain that indicate pain, that represent that pain. And in fact, we know people who have phantom limb syndrome have their limbs cut off and still claim to experience pain, suffering, the ability to move their hand and so on, even when they've had their arm chopped off. So those kinds of mysteries, if I experience a certain kind of pain, why is that pain not existent independently of my neurophysiology? Okay, we're back to it being intimate somehow, but when we wanted to describe the mechanism of intimacy, it starts to break down a little bit. People, you start to get into this, you get all kinds of crazy shit like Penrose microtubules and, trying to understand, to continue to deepen or complexify the physical story doesn't really shed a whole lot of light or heat on these other kinds of properties as such.
Yeah. So, I kind of want to get into a bunch of other ways of thinking about this because I think there's a way I think we've really pointed to the mystery of it quite a bit. And hopefully people have experienced that. And maybe as we kind of circle around these other ways of handling it, the mystery will, come along for the ride as well. But I think some people really have intuitions the other way, right? Like this thing about pushing it all the way the other way. Like, let's just say, like, hey, if you've ever gone under general anesthesia, it was sort of like, you disappeared for a while, you woke back up, or you go to bed at night and you fall asleep and maybe you have dreams, which are kind of conscious, but like there's times when you're not dreaming, deep sleep. There's no REM sleep happening there, REM sleep. So, all right, what happens there? Well, you're just sort of gone, right? And so, okay, well, there's definitely we can correlate this pretty well. And this isn't like mysterious to people. We're like, oh, whatever the consciousness was that was happening during your waking life ain't there when your body's doing another thing. So it seems like, the causal property of some interaction between or whatever you want to call it, causal or interactive or something, is happening that's correlating with the physical thing. Or even take the pain in your arm. Hey, if you put in local anesthesia, it's like we know this molecules in this syringe will do a thing which will like disappear something out of your conscious awareness, right? Yeah. Like at some level, to think that there's some weird woo mystical fucking soul realm of conscious entities, spirits and souls floating around that are like immaterial, like
this is most of human civilization, by the way. Exactly what you're saying. I think of that is spooky spirit stuff. Like it is just the extra stuff. It is this
totally
non-physical substance, to use Descartes' language, some spirit stuff that animates the body. I mean, this seems to be this is the plausible story of consciousness for thousands of years, and it's only now in this age of higher science that we're even, we can imagine taking a functional MRI of your brain as soon as you wake up in the morning and smell that bacon. Right. So to your point, we can get, it's like, look at that. I could look at that 3D model of the brain. You see that red area right there? You see that green area? That's you experiencing bacon smell. What do you mean that's me experiencing bacon smell?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to speak to our listeners who like have the intuition of like literally 180 degrees the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
right? It seems really fucking obvious there isn't anything else, right? Like, it's just like, look, if I fall asleep and the consciousness goes away and I wake up and it goes away, or you put me in anesthesia, it goes away, and I come back and it goes away, or I fucking, take some LSD and it changes it, and then I, or whatever. Like, we have so many examples of like shit that's basically like molecules and energy and matter doing something radically to our lived conscious experience. It seems like whatever it is that the consciousness is very, very tightly coupled, at least, to whatever the physical substrate is. I don't think it's this. I mean, I don't buy these dualist. I'm going to get a little argumentative here, like these dualistic style arguments, like, Chalmers in his book, The Conscious Mind, kind of is a response. Daniel Dennett wrote Consciousness Explained, which is sort of like, some people say it's consciousness explained away, because he's like a very physicalist guy. And, Chalmers kind of came back making a strong argument for a kind of quasi-modernist dualism. Like, you can't just eliminate the conscious properties. And I'm like, well, I mean, to some degree, whatever kind of leftover something, whatever the thing that Mary experiences, the color scientist, has to be extremely tightly coupled to the physical substrate in ways that you can't really blame somebody like Daniel Dennett for going like, yeah, it's just fucking causally linked. Maybe we don't understand the causal linkage, but like, come on, dude. There's no fucking Cartesian theater in the mind. There's no fucking window into another realm. It's just, we already can see all these ways that it's really just enmeshed with the physical substrate. We have so many examples. It's a bit silly.
Well, here's where I think the mystery deepens, and I wanna pull us back from. And I told you this in the past. I am one who's very drawn to what is known as eliminativism, which is this. Daniel Dennett is Paul and Patricia Churchland also I think are known as these. And I love Daniel Dennett. I mean, I think the guy's great.
Yep.
And yet, the eliminativist position is one of the species of not it's just these properties are just these properties, and there's some identity relationship between the mental and physical properties, but that there are no conscious properties. We simply eliminate them, that they're curious manner of speaking that is a holdover from talking about spirit stuff and folk psychology and this and that. And instead there is this, it's so tightly coupled so as not to exist, which is to say it's an illusion. Well,
sure.
And so that's going to run squarely into people's intuitions about things. And I'll explain why. So I'll stick with our coffee example, our bacon and coffee. Let's use coffee this time. If you have this behavior of reaching for the coffee that goes back to the story of the coffee molecules striking the inside of your nose and creating some kind of sensation in your brain, we stipulated that is a complete causal story. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That if we were some sort of robot we were programmed to sense through sensor technology those molecules and engage when you sense that, you engage in the grabbing behavior of a cup of coffee anytime it's nearby, and those molecules are emitted from the cup. You could program the robot to grab it and pick up the cup, and yet we would not ascribe consciousness to that causal physical process. We would also say that causal physical process, despite being in a human being, is 100% causally efficacious. Do you see what I mean by that?
To explain it.
To explain the grabbing behavior. That we did not need the what it's like properties to explain the grabbing behavior. But if that's what it means, then that means you have consciousness as this useless epiphenomenon. That the what it's like character of property of this particular phenomenon is not what causes you to do the reaching at all. And that's very counterintuitive. Like, no, it's the experience of the coffee smell that makes me grab for it. Not this other stuff about molecules and sensory motor cortex moving, you know, all this kind of stuff. So we find ourselves on the horns of a dilemma that I think is pretty baffling. So on the one hand, if you deny that, as Dennett does, he denies the existence of these properties, much less that they, you know, are causally efficacious, right? So all the causal efficacy happens through this certain kind of story, right?
Yeah.
This narrative of explanation through scientific or objective means. The subjective aspects of whatever that intimate story is, that we all acknowledge exist, like the redness of Mary's apple, the smelliness of the coffee, whatever, those properties just hang out. They seem like these, like, what the hell are they for? If they're not causally efficacious, why are they hanging on for the ride? Why are we not just unconscious robots unfolding a physics story without consciousness, riding along in an illusion?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question.
And if there is, and so if we say, okay, well, that's not the case, we have to say that these properties are causally efficacious. We already stipulated that it seems like there's 100% of causal efficacy already in the explanation. So now we have properties that are also explaining some phenomenon through a causal physical story because we want to ascribe causal efficacy to them. Then we have what is known as causal overdetermination.
Yes.
Which is what we've already got 100% of the causal story. What is this extra stuff? What is it doing?
Yeah. What is it doing? Yeah. I mean, I love that you hit this one. I mean, I'm feeling the part of me that wants to counter argument. Maybe we're going to recapitulate some internal debates in the philosophy of mind here. But what I'm getting about the one you just said here, to sum it up, is, okay, I think of it as the problem of epiphenomenalism, right? What you talked about. It's like, well, if we have a full causal story over here with all the physics, but there's this other thing that comes along for the ride, that's the awareness, the consciousness, but it doesn't do anything. That doesn't seem like it makes any sense either. Especially, I mean, if I were to fucking just say to you, hey man, I'm having an experience of what it's like to be here, right? Like, what the fuck is causing my mouth to do that besides the fucking conscious properties, right?
Right.
So you can't define the conscious properties as strictly non-causal. Otherwise, humans like you and me would never say shit like, ooh, the redness of that red, right? Like we would never say those words. So there has to be something, right? Like, I think epiphenomenalism is crap. I mean, I think the overdetermination, causal overdetermination, is another reason why it is as well. Like, whatever it is.
But those are the horns of the dilemma. You either have to be committed to causal overdetermination, or you have to be committed to epiphenomenalism.
I don't know. I don't think so. But maybe. I mean,
if we can split that baby somehow or get out of that problem,
right?
Then you know, we may be able to contribute something, come out of philosophy of mind retirement and contribute something to literature.
Sure, but I'm just saying, like, these different competing schools of thought try to do that. Like, I think the emergentists actually try to answer the problem of the epiphenomenalism in some way, right? Where they're saying something like, look, whatever those conscious properties are, it's some kind of byproduct. Let's just say there's, you know, a dumb rock or dust, moon dust, or some, you know, there's nothing there, right? It's just very simple, you know, molecules of matter kind of just stacked up randomly, clumped together in heaps, right? But then you get something like a complex enough structure, right? Whatever complex enough means, let's just leave that aside for a moment. But whatever that is, it starts to exhibit something that is like a conscious property. I mean, the simplest example in the philosophy of mind is a thermostat. Like, is a thermostat conscious, right? And you know, it might sound weird, like, what the heck do people mean? Why? But, like, well, it has a sensory input, which is the temperature, right? And it has an actuator, which is like to switch on or switch off,
right?
The temperature control mechanism. So it has a sensor and it has an actuator, and it has an internal state. And essentially, the internal state interacts with the sensor and the actuator in a feedback loop. And maybe that right there is the sufficient degree of physical complexity that
to give
would
rise
kind
to some conscious
to give
property?
rise to
Yeah.
some conscious property. And then if you kind of like, give your thermostat a mouth or something, or a memory or whatever, like it can start to tell you, yeah, it was hot yesterday, so I turned on the AC, and then it got cool, and then I turned on the heater, and it was at this time, right? Right. You could just imagine just adding a few more features, and maybe, I'm adding a whole big chunk of features here, but whatever it is, if you give it an ability to communicate about what it's doing, it might then indeed start to exhibit the behavior. Like they would have us impute consciousness to it. Like, I believe you're conscious, Max, but I never, and this is the problem of other minds, like I don't have direct access to your consciousness, but I believe that you're conscious because your behavior exhibits some version of the whatever it is that I would impute consciousness to in a kind of transitive way by observing your behavior. Well, I mean, if your talking thermostat was doing something like that, you might be like, oh, it's a super duper simple organism that can communicate about its inner state, including interacting with the world based on its inner state. Maybe it is sufficiently conscious, and that's all we need. Like, once you get to this level of complexity, you cannot help but impute something consciousness-like. And if it can communicate, you cannot help but talk about it in those what it is like terms. You just can't help it.
We know there are single-celled organisms that have this sensory input kind of thing that you're talking about. Like, they're able to determine something in their surrounding. And it's like, like
an amoeba.
Amoeba. Yeah. It's like, if it gets hot by a certain number of degrees, turn left. It might be as simple as that in terms of its quote unquote programming. If you think about amoeba as being, and they have a high degree of complexity relative to other things in the universe, like a simple atom. But they're far less complex than a multicelled organism, or even a higher level organism like a fish or a cat or an ape. And when we think of it on a continuum of complexity, it seems like that there is a broader and deeper level of both phenomenal consciousness and intelligence that accompanies this complexity. So there's no doubt that complexity plays some sort of role. The question is, does complexity suffice to explain the relationship between the mental properties on the one hand and physical properties on the other? Maybe there's a part of the explanatory gap that gets covered through some understanding of complexity, the relationships between parts and wholes. We are, after all, multicelled organisms. Each individual cell might not be conscious per se, but in the aggregate, the way they're configured, there seems to be something that happens with that level of complexity that we can point to and say, okay, that's significant. So what then, going back to this question of robots and artificial intelligence, and not to linger on that too long, because we want to do a whole episode on that, as we say. Yeah. But it seems like if we can begin faithfully to represent or replicate the minimum viable of what you just described, of those inputs, outputs, and everything in between, and not be behaviorists about it, because behaviorists thought everything in the brain was kind of a black box. And we needed the cognitive science revolution. The cognitive science revolution really brought us out of the kind of the behaviorist way of thinking, which, though understandable, was woefully inadequate. Right? Yeah. Humans are not like tropistic animals, stimulus response creatures. And understanding what's in the black box is really, really fucking important to understanding both consciousness and indeed, neuroscience and genetics and the rest of it. So like, tell me about your particular views on this question of complexity. Are you persuaded that does some explanatory work to unpack that connection?
Yeah, I mean, I have one of my good friends, who I've known for years. We have this debate over and over again, and I think in the end I'm of two minds. And one is the emergent complexity version,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of like it actually is sort of a Darwinistic life version. Like if you, like we talk about the amoeba, like you can say, oh, look at this amoeba. And it's like, oh, it's sort of, or a little flagellate kind of single cell thing. It's like, it's moving towards the nutrients, right? So it's like, it's moving towards the nutrient gradient, moving up in the positive. And you could be like, oh, it sort of seems like it wants like more of those little like sugar molecules over in the little pond or something like this. And is that conscious or not conscious? In some way, it starts to collapse down to like what we mean by almost the same thing we mean by life or a living thing, right? It has some kind of a relationship with its environment where it's sort of a local decrease of entropy, right? There's some kind of thermodynamic dissipation process that it's doing with its environment, and it's sort of like kind of like acquiring some of the energy kind of in an asymmetrical way, you know, across its boundary. It's sort of like hoarding up some energy and is using that energy to build some kind of internal mechanisms out of like little molecules, and then it uses that to essentially like gather more energy to, right, keep persisting. And you would be like, okay, let's say this is some rough approximation of what it means to be alive, right? Well, the complexity emergence view of consciousness, I think, kind of correlates pretty strongly with these kinds of intuitions about life. Like whatever properties that the biophysics has that makes the thing sort of appear to be alive is just, what if it's just basically one and the same as some kind of like proto consciousness? Maybe not a fully fledged human level of consciousness, but let's say it's sort of like a degree, like a drop of one of these mental properties, you might say. And you kind of have to keep building up more of these layers of complexity. And if you kind of, you know, think of Douglas Hofstadter's book, I Am a Strange Loop, or his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Gödel Bach, from way back in the late 70s, he talks about this idea of like, well, if you get like a sophisticated enough multi-layer feedback loop inside of the information structure that is built out of molecules, neurons, or whatever the hell it's built out of, sort of, he's trying to abstract it one layer away so it doesn't matter what you're talking about it being built out of, but it's sort of like some kind of nested recursive layers of self-representation.
Yes.
Right. And once you have that, you start to get something that looks like the human level of consciousness, or maybe the dog level of consciousness, or the mammalian level of the brain, or whatever kind of thing, where suddenly it's like, oh, it's not just sort of, you know, just immediately responding to like nutrients in its environment, like an amoeba, go get more nutrients. Is, you know, it's actually has a representation of its own internal subsystems. Antonio Damasio talks about this too with his somatic marker idea, like as the kind of proto-consciousness, that there's actually some interstate representation of the internal, whatever, soma, the body-mind system, and that thing inside of an information structure, like that relates that internal state to external percepts, right? And now you're starting to get like the beginnings of a narrative self or ego or whatever you want to call that thing, that is kind of getting you to this layer of consciousness that kind of we have that would have us fucking say words about being conscious beings, right? Like once you kind of ramp up enough of this thing, you get a multi-layered feedback loop, and that information structure is the thing that would have you at least have human-like consciousness that's being built out of this kind of proto-consciousness that, say, like a thermostat has. You see what I'm saying? This is the emergentist account that I like. I like it.
It's a curious thing to think about, because we have, for one thing, you have I'm looking at something on my computer screen right now that is a red dot. Okay.
Yeah.
It's what I could hit to close the recording right now. Okay. And that red dot appears to me in a certain way. Appears to being the word phenomenon. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a close connection between appeared to in English and the Latin, or the Greek rather, Latin or Greek, maybe both. Hell, I don't know. phenomenon. Okay.
Yeah.
This appeared to quality of our consciousness. And yet we have to parse, just focusing on that one red dot for a moment, as one single quale, okay, which is the singular version of qualia. Qualia being the totality of our experience. When you start to talk about this complex array that seems to be interwoven of the theory of other minds, with Michael Porcelli, he's wearing headphones. There's all of these other, I'm tapping into all these memory systems and all of this other baggage from having known you that accompany my perceptions of you on the screen. But I can get rid of all of that and just focus on the dot for a moment, the red dot.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some specific quality in experiencing that red dot, its redness, that appears in my consciousness, and I can isolate that. That isolable quale of redness, if I just restrict a conversation to that for a moment, then I want to know, going backwards on the complexity continuum. Let's say it's a continuum from highly complex, which are human beings, and maybe our future robot overlords, or the aliens that are waiting outside of our stratosphere, to meet us. That all of us have this ability to apprehend red. Now, we'll pass over for a moment the question of whether my red looks like your red, or yours looks like green and mine looks like red, and we have an inverted spectrum. But let's just assume for a moment that what it's like quality for all of us is the same. That redness that we all experience, redness R, okay, as a conscious property.
Quail. Yeah.
And then we extend that backwards through layers of diminished complexity. How far does that quail redness go?
Right.
When you know. We have to have a visual system. Do we have to have a visual system in the brain? We have to have some sort of eyes. Do we have to have eyes, or is redness experienced in a different way through these more crude sensory, what proto eyes? I don't know what, there's a sensory receptors in some animals, and plants. Yeah. The plants are able to pick up light.
Tropism. Yeah.
Yep, and tropism is a response to different levels of for photosynthesis purposes, but also because you need to be drawn to the light to get it. But if you get too much, you need to back off. So you'll find plants moving away from the light, and those tropistic creatures are definitely stimulus response. But is there something it is like for them to experience more red light or more blue light, for example?
Yeah.
And that qualitative aspect of their experience, does it even exist? Or is tropism simply a causal physical story that doesn't require this other epiphenomenal baggage? And so it seems intuitively plausible that complexity tracks with the ability to see, for me to apprehend or be able to experience or have a what is like quality of the red dot on my screen right now. But I'm not sure it explains the connection at that point, the mechanism at that point for that metaphysical intimacy between the two properties, mental and physical.
Yeah. I mean, this is a little bit, either there's a way you keep trying to pull into the mystery of it, and I respect that, and I get it. And if I look at writers like Sam Harris, or listen to what he says about consciousness, or his wife has a new book called Conscious, and she likes to do this too, and very much in the tradition of David Chalmers. But trip out on this, man. Like, what? How in the world is that really? Why does there have to be a quail there? Like, come on, like you can account for this without a quail. And and my inner Daniel Dennett, this is the perspective of man, at least during this portion of our conversation, says, I don't think you need to have something that radical as a qualia or a quail or a conscious property. It can simply be, and we can put placeholders here, as many of them as we want, which you might say is lazy philosophizing, but let's just say whatever this is, it's an interaction between these subparts, right? This is to kind of invoke this idea of like sub-agents to the human brain. I mean, this the corpus callosum split brain experiments gave us some experimental indication there could be, two major sub-agents in the body. Ian McGilchrist talks about this in his book, The Master and His Emissary, and split brain people have talked about it for a long time. Marvin Minsky in 1986 talked about the society of mind. Like, what if there's a whole bunch of sub-agents here in our brains that are just attending to different things? And even in the therapy world, you have like internal family systems or kind of parts work or parts therapy. Like, get these different parts to talk about, what they want inside yourself, like as almost like a therapeutic process, right? And I would say there's, in both AI research in terms of the society of mind stuff that Minsky was talking about, and in the therapeutic one, these intuitively kind of make sense. It's a split brain. It makes sense with that. And it makes sense with Dennett's, he calls it his multiple drafts theory. And like, well, okay, this linguistic part of you, what the part that talks or that forms words to talk, what is it doing? Well, it's kind of, if you're kind of quiet, and you're not talking, sometimes you can notice little kind of like words pop through your mind or little sentence fragments, little blips. And it's like, what is that thing doing? It's sort of like, it's almost just sort of like, it's over there, ready. You need to talk. Okay. Here comes a stream of words, blah, 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 right? Like, and it's whatever. And then there's some other part of you that's like, I don't know, some narrative, autobiographical. My name is Michael Porcelli, and I was born in Escondido, California in 1974. And then I went to this school. And then, right, like, this historical data bank kind of like strung together like in a narrative style of a database. Okay, that's in there. And there's this other part that's sort of like, light, color, objects, right? It's just going like 3D world. It's just completely reconstituting a 3D world out here, right? And then I'm like, oh, then there's some kind of social part of me. It's like, oh, other minds. Yep, there's another human being over here. His name is Max. Yep, and you're talking with him. Okay, cool. And then somehow there's some like output where I can like interact these things together where it goes, yes, the quail of that red dot, bro. I'm like,
yeah.
What am I
doing? There's a continuity among all of those different systems that makes it holistic. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, but what if the emergent account is saying like, it's nothing more than that, right? It's nothing more than some confluence. I mean, let's say we have this, like Hofstadter said, this recursive layered self-representation where I can just, well, what is that? Well, that's another process. It's the introspector. It's sort of like, what's going on in there, right? And it goes, and I can do this thing, all these things together. But like, I could ask myself, what's going on in there? There's a red dot. Okay, here's a narrative part that can make words, and I'm like, here's a Max that can listen to the words, and it goes like, blah, the quail of a red dot, blah, and like, what is that? That's nothing more than like all these subparts sort of got into a little queue for a second, and they just went boom, 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 and then I fucking exhibited a behavior, right? And that seems like what it is like, seems like I'm narrating a conscious experience, but it's not necessarily that there's some kind of like Cartesian theater that has just a strict continuity, but there's no strict continuity. There's not even a strict continuity of consciousness, like necessarily. There's just a bunch of sub-agents kind of in a row.
This reminds me of that multiple drafts theory from Dennett too.
Yeah, that's his thing. Yeah.
Before we, I want to, give eliminativism its due, because I really do think that my instinct, it's a bias. Let's call it a bias. My bias is an Occam's razor kind of thing, right? For anything, right. I'm biased to science, and I believe that science has demonstrated throughout history that it knows how to do more explanatory work than anything, than any other kind of or mode of being human to confer understanding. And so when there is this great temptation to defer to science, so you get the Douglas Hofstadter self-referential loops sort of, and you can he could probably do some sort of mathematical equations to sort of describe or limn that phenomenon. in a way that would make a mathematician feel like, ooh, that field seems to fill in the gap nicely. And then there,
Yep.
Roger Penrose will come along and describe this phenomenon of microtubules, which is a theoretical
Right.
construct that he, as a physicist, has, that at the level of consciousness in the brain, that there's a certain physical
Yep.
property of microtubules, and when it does a certain thing, boom, that represents consciousness. And look, there are all of these different kinds of stories in physics, stories in
Yep.
math, and
Yep.
and they're almost like extra philosophical, outside of philosophy, in the way you regard them, because philosophy deals with the subjective and they're dealing with the objective. And so when you say, look, you're trying to describe a Cartesian theater that doesn't exist, yes, but to deny those conscious properties as they appear in every moment of waking life is equally problematic in sort of being at odds with our intuitions. So
Yes.
my intuitions about conscious properties are strong. My bias towards scientific explanations, and I love the sort of fractal aesthetic nature of the kind of Hofstadter line of thinking, because when you talked earlier about taking acid or taking mushrooms, you can see the sort of fractal nature of consciousness in those kinds of experiences, and they're radically subjective experiences. There's no scientist that can come along and tell you exactly what you're perceiving. There's at least, is it in principle possible? That I don't know, but there's something radically subjective about the hallucinatory experience of someone taking acid. You might be able to do a functional MRI. You might be able to do a neuroscience of 50 years from now that say they are likely experiencing something that looks vaguely fractal and has light sources, and they're tapping into these certain memory banks from their past to do some kind of, vague impressionistic maybe theory of what you got going on in you. But that is what is going on inside the person who's taken the LSD is profound and direct in ways that the functional MRI and its accoutrements will never be able to describe.
Yeah.
Now I want to challenge you for a moment to take so we described this process from, maybe there's these like actuators and these little sensory inputs and actuators on something like a thermometer that represent the most basic requirements for having what it's like properties, for having conscious properties. Okay. At some level of consciousness, there got to be some level of complexity. It's gonna, maybe it's not a moment, maybe it's a continuum, but at some point we'll start to have these kind of properties that we're talking about, and the referent will be the same. Okay, but let's extrapolate that into levels of consciousness that are higher. Levels of complexity that are higher than humans.
Okay.
All right. In fact, let's talk about the universe as being, the multiverse even, as being one of those levels of potential levels of complexity that could have higher level emergent properties. This is the thing because this is the way I'm acknowledging your emergentist thesis, because I do think there is something to this. I'm not sure it resolves the questions of the explanatory gap between physical and mental properties, but it definitely, there is some at least correspondence to level of complexity and richness of conscious experience.
Yes.
Okay. And same goes with intelligence, and same goes with other emergent properties, okay? That you might bundle with consciousness.
Sure.
And ask yourself, what is it like to be the universe? And my answer to that question is, I sure as hell don't know, because I don't know what it's like to be a bat either and experience echolocation as a conscious property. But I can tell you this. I think bats do have some experience of echolocation, that there are phenomenal properties associated with being a bat. And therefore, there could be a level of consciousness associated with emergent properties in the universe. And this is the moment I went from, by the way, I'll confide in you, being an agnostic instead of an atheist. Okay. Not only did I have peak experiences with certain substances we've been talking about on the show, that caused me to have this sense of the ineffable and the noetic, as properties of experience, of my experience, that made me back off from my rabid atheism and the Sam Harris variety. But also it's this, when I coupled that with extrapolating into levels of complexity beyond human complexity, it prompted me to question whether there is an emergent consciousness that is even higher level to humans, and it works on a different scale to human scale consciousness. So that prompted me to walk back from the precipice, I guess you could say, of atheism into agnosticism, to say, okay, maybe the universe is consciousness. Maybe there is this collective all mind that has causal properties that are far more sophisticated in their interconnections and their holism, and they are accompanied by emergent properties of consciousness that are orders of magnitude more complex and strange than I could ever imagine. And that could be something that is, if not God, a deity of some sort, a living universe.
Like a super conscious thing.
Yeah.
Okay. This is fun, because I think we're going to branch off from, it's kind of weird that you were sort of thinking of it as an extension of emergentism. And I think I can get behind that. I think there's a way I follow the emergentism sort of all the way. Like let me just say, like, if I have parts, I have an inner sort of Dan Dennett emergent complexity part, right?
Yeah.
And this part can go all the way, as you say, kind of superscalar, like supra human, whatever, integrative entity thing. But I also have an internal panpsychist as well.
Tell us about that.
Tell
us about both of those things.
They kind of wrap around in this sort of weird way.
Okay.
Like, I actually, in the real early days of Wikipedia, I was sort of just finding Wikipedia pages that didn't exist yet, and I created the panpsychist one like a long, long time ago.
Bless you, my child.
It was terrible, but like it's been much improved by others since I was there. But so panpsychism, just real briefly, is this idea that, like, well, it's not just amoebas. What if you can push conscious properties all the way down, right? Like, let's say it's not even an emergent thing, right? The thermostat is the simplest example. Let's just say it's an actual kind of fundamental property, right? In the same way, that we certain versions of physics think of matter and energy as fundamental properties. If you go to quantum theory, it's not even matter and energy anymore. It's wave functions, and a wave function is a weird mathematical thingy, which is kind of like energy and kind of like matter and kind of like neither. It almost like a wave function like emanates matter and energy out of it. But a quantum physics person would say, no, that thing is the real thing. And these other things that we see and experience as matter and energy are like actually emergent properties of wave functions. Well, what if it was sort of like that? Like, what if there's some, conscious field, right? That's actually just woven right into the fabric of fundamental physics. And
is this more like
a panpsychist view?
What is his name? Friedrich. I can't remember his name, but there's two different versions of this.
Capra, yes.
There's analytic philosophy versions of panpsychism, and then there's this sort of woo
version.
Yeah, that's more like verging on pseudoscience, but also kind of interesting in its own way.
Yeah. I can't remember. The Tao of Physics was one of the books I think Capra wrote, and there's another one.
Yeah,
very similar themes. I mean, there's a place I don't want to go, which is the kind of Deepak Chopra.
Right. I don't either.
Dime store version where it's like, look, it's the conscious brain that's collapsing the wave function, so our minds are creating the universe, and I'm like, no, it's not the little human brain with the eyeballs that's like creating the experience outside of itself, which is weird. I mean, I don't buy that at all. But I do think Bohm did it too, the implicate order, David Bohm, and he was a serious physicist. And if you read actually some of these early, like Schrödinger and can't remember the guy with the started with an E. I can't remember his name. Eddington, I think. These guys were fairly mystical. These quantum physics, and actually Ken Wilber edited together a book called Quantum Questions, where he took some of the most mystical passages written by
Interesting.
hardcore, and Bohm is one of them, and this is a little bit in that department or in that area where you're kind of saying like maybe there is further science. Like even physicists will simply tell you like, look, we cannot reconcile Einstein's general theory of relativity with quantum physics, right? But we have had the experience, in the Kuhn's idea of the scientific paradigms changing. We've already had the experience of like the Newtonian physics worldview giving way to the Einsteinian one, where the Einsteinian one explains everything the Newtonian one does and explains more. So it's like a proper superset of Newtonian physics, and the construct, the mathematical construct, is different than the Newtonian mathematical construct. You actually get rid of this sort of like fixed Cartesian grid that is sort of built on the ether as a fixed reference point. All of Newtonian physics is based on that, and it's like Einstein comes along and says, guess what? That's not there, right? It's not there. And we can do better physics if we get rid of it, which sort of, it starts fucking with almost like our folk physics intuitions of like matter and space at the kind of scope and scale that we're at. But if you take this idea that, well, there's probably a further paradigm shift in physics somewhere in the future that maybe integrates quantum and Einstein.
Yeah.
There are definitely some people that are like, oh, that's where we're going to discover the fucking consciousness field, maybe. Or the thing that is the fundamental thing, right? So at this point, it's not sort of like an emergent supermind, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's like a fundamental supermind, which is already fucking there. Which is like if you take this intuition that you could push down like degrees of consciousness, from a human to a bat to an amoeba to a thermostat, you can actually just keep going all the way down, and now you get like what it is like to be a quark or something, or a subatomic particle, and it just has like a little conscious feature to it,
and it's just it's more of a combinatorial set of attributes of this fundamental layer that's always there. And I think
it's always there.
Yeah, this is the what's interesting to me about Eastern philosophy. And I think I love that I came from the analytic sort of Anglo-American tradition of philosophy of mind, and later in life got to discover some of these ideas. I think a good bridge is the Dancing Wu Li Masters.
Yes,
that's a great.
That's the other one.
Yeah, but that was one of the bridges. But then later on, I started just getting into the Vedic traditions and non-dual thinking, and it, I really want to caution. I mean, there's a lot that that's ancient and mythopoetic, and you really have to disentangle some of the beautiful, clear philosophical insights from the mythopoetic aspects, but don't jettison them, because they're going to give you a mode of understanding that you might not otherwise be able to grasp, but for the intuition pumps that these mythopoetic modes of understanding provide. And I know it sounds like it's at odds with science, but I don't think it is. It goes more to the ineffable quality of some of these things, because after all, it's our subjective states we're talking about, right? It's got to do that at some level. And this is why I think jettisoning philosophy is about ideas as AI progresses and neuroscience progresses. But it's also important that we keep all kinds of philosophy in the mix. And Eastern philosophy is an interesting one. It goes back to your Berkeleyan idealism and your simulation theory, and some of these ideas of panpsychism really are like, we are not separate from these phenomena. We are all a unitary consciousness. That unitary consciousness is an aspect of a physical substrate that can be apprehended through different means, which we might call the objective or scientific, but they are still part of it. And so the mystical understanding and the Enlightenment understanding of Buddhist monks in meditation and those enlightenment experiences, these mysteries or paradoxes seem to collapse in on themselves to understanding.
Yes.
And we're chasing a very Western, very logical, very causal oriented understanding of this, where they are embracing the psychonaut. And I'm not trying to get woo with this, by the way. I'm trying to say,
I get you.
The mode of understanding the world around you is as much phenomenological as it is anything else. In fact, as I said at the beginning, as you said at the beginning, our entire waking lives are composed of just these properties, and we're making inferences beyond them to talk about objective phenomena through scientific means and in nature. So we have to be careful about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and doing that meditative practice allows you a mode of understanding these phenomena that scientific stuff will never allow. And listening to the mystics and the yogis talk about non-dual reality can actually inform some of our philosophical ways of unpacking this stuff. And that's why I love it. You taught me something today, Michael Porcelli, when you said, I think, that there is a way in which the eliminativism can kind of bend around and come in contact with the panpsychism.
Yes.
You know, that.
Yes.
And I think the yogis give us some potential path to doing that, at least not understanding it and being able to articulate it in the ways that Western philosophers are familiar with and want to have, because we love dialogue, we love sharing knowledge through language, but there are other ways of having shared understanding, and it's like, try having this subjective experience, and meditation gives us a path to that in some way. And I can't explain it fully. A lot of philosophers of mind would probably poo-poo that, but I don't give a shit.
Yeah. I mean, Sam Harris is very much into meditation and tries to teach it in a kind of a secular way. I mean, there's actually Western phenomenology. Husserl was a Western phenomenologist that would do these techniques, which resembled very much kind of Buddhist or Vedantic techniques. I think the Buddhist and Vedantic systems are way more sophisticated for doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But in a way, it's not surprising. I just want to, forward the concept in the middle of this conversation here of naturalism, which I feel like encompasses everything that we just talked about here.
Yes, it does.
In a way, like reality, one way I put it is like reality is just contiguous with itself, right? This idea, whatever you want to call it, it's all interconnected, right? It's all one. The one is many. The many is one, right? There's no place where we could penetrate downwards, inwards with our microscopes, or outwards further and further and like discover some kind of like fundamental fissure in reality, right? Even if it's the multiverse or whatever, the various conceptualizations of the multiverse, I mean, there's still some sense in which it's like contiguous, right? Even if you take the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, like there's, we can never perceive these branching parts of the wave function, but you want to know what? Like they're still connected to the wave function that we're inside of.
That's right.
Like,
and even though you and I can never share our subjective states, at least we don't have any kind of understanding for how one might do that. I can't be in the Porcelli subjectivity. I can't have your window on the world from there in San Diego, nor can you have my window on the world from Austin. But it's not just that. There is a contiguity there, but there's also a separateness. The mystics speak of the illusion of separateness and the unity and the contiguity or continuity that whose features can confuse us into thinking everything is decomposable into parts. And we need to do that decomposition in order to make some sort of analysis or evaluation in sort of Western logical terms, telling linear stories. But we also, don't throw the phenomenology out with the bathwater. Is what I heard you saying. We can't do that, and that idea of all of us being connected to a super phenomenology um,
Yeah.
is an interesting, at least, direction of inquiry, and there are
Yeah.
multiple ways to conduct that inquiry, including
Yeah.
meditation.
Totally. And if you take this naturalistic idea, we, in a way, it doesn't surprise me, right? It doesn't surprise me of the if you do follow the introspective instructions, like a Vedantic or a Tibetan Buddhist or something, and you go like, and you do that kind of like inner space direction, and you become like super fucking expert at it, right? And you read their scriptures and you talk with the monks, and you guys are meditating, 12 hours a day for like 12 years or 20 years or whatever it is that they're doing. And it's kind of like, oh, and then they're saying like, but yes, see this? There's this unified field of a something overmind and a whatever, I'm simplifying. But then you go the other way. This is the wraparound thing. You weigh out the physics way and you're like, it's just one quantum wave function, right? Like, is this at this point simply two different languages? And this is a little bit of like bringing in philosophy of language. Are these just two different languages that we're using to essentially describe the same thing? In Western philosophy, we've called this like neutral monism. Sometimes it's called property dualism. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's nuances between those two things. But whatever this is, it's sort of like, hey, it's like the elephant, right? We're just touching different parts of the elephant.
Right.
Or like we're looking at it from a different approach. Or you might say from a behavioral inquiry way or a pragmatist way. You could say like, look, take these actions, and those actions produce an interaction with your environment that brings forth the world, right? This is the kind of, Ken Wilber will say this sometimes, right? It brings forth this world where you will see it and understand it. But in a way, like, the way that you kind of get in the world of arts, like these, this resembles that, or like these kind of motifs or like echoes, right? This verse of the poem rhymes with that verse of the poem, or that tune from this jingle in the commercial reminds you of this classical song from over there, or whatever it is. Like you could see these different art movements sometimes recapitulate previous art movements. Like, what are these resemblances that are kind of there? It's like, yeah, there is some weird resemblance when you like do the friggin' physics way out this way, or you do the friggin' introspection way out that way. They start saying shit that sort of sounds like poetically the same.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
Yes. It's almost like, matter and antimatter or something like that, or features in the universe that seem completely at odds, but represent some sort of mirroring or pattern, and I want to go back quickly to something you said a minute ago, because I don't want to close without having done so. Because as much as I want people to be psychonauts, right, to explore their consciousness, and particularly through meditation, and I'm a baby in this regard, but I think it is so very important to do so, that neither you nor I in this episode, we are committed to, as you put it, naturalism, what the philosophers of mind called physicalism. Okay, so talking about meditation, talking about phenomenal states, does not commit us to anything that exists that is a non-physical stuff. So
supernatural,
no
supernatural,
right? To be is to be causally efficacious, right? There is no entity that does not have some sort of causal efficacy, even if it's just it's being a quantum of space-time arranged in a certain way. That at least is to be manifest in the universe in some way, and that has causal implications. Okay.
Yes.
So at no point, even when you get into the mystical, even when you get into the mythopoetic, even when you get to the noetic and the ineffable, where you are not committing, at least I'm not committing, and I want to ask you this question. I'm not committing to the existence of spirit stuff, spookies, supernatural entities. What I'm pointing to is to the existence of something that is deeply mysterious and stands in certain kind of relationship to different modes of understanding, but can exist in its totality as one phenomenon that is physical.
Sure.
Okay? Because as I said, to exist, to be, ontology, right, is to be physical, is to be causal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be non-existence.
Right.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, your thoughts on that? Are you a physicalist as well? I'm hearing that you are, but maybe not. I mean, an eliminativist is. A panpsychist isn't necessarily committed to metaphysical entities of a strange sort that would be non-causal entities.
I mean, I think this is great. I think you could be a naturalist panpsychist, which is a place I sort of have, like, if I have my inner eliminativist, I also have my inner naturalist panpsychist, and I sort of oscillate between these two things, and whether they're even different, I'm not even sure sometimes, but like, yes, even the word physicalist is a little constraining. I think it doesn't quite. That's why I like naturalism better. It's sort of, physicalism kind of has this connotation that it's like built out of stuff, and I'm like, well, I mean,
this could be energy. It could be.
Right.
It could be
wave functions,
relational properties,
or some other thing.
You know.
Yes. Okay. We're getting into an interesting place with that.
Yeah.
And you're getting a little bit ahead of me with the relational part, but totally. I would say there's something informational and something relational. And this is where, if I'm going to like tilt into woo, this is where I would go. I mean, I'll just do an example from my real life, right? Like, as you know, my dad died earlier this year, right? Now, before he died, I could imagine my dad in my mind, and I'd be like, yeah, that's dad. But I'm getting that's my thought form of dad, right?
Yeah.
And there's the physical form of dad, right? But you know what's really trippy? After he died, suddenly the thought forms of dad got much louder. Like, he appeared in my dreams much more frequently. I heard his voice in my ear more. I was remembering like his pre-Alzheimer's personality a lot more vividly. And I'm like, oh, well, this is sort of like probably the experiences people had that would have them think, the ghosts of their ancestors or their recently departed, parent is, right? That is the visitation of the ghost. What else would it be? But I'm definitely having my own, inside my own phenomenology, an experience of these things. Now, what I call those things descriptively is another sort of, participation in a language game that's kind of part of a theoretical construct. I'm calling that, into my modern mind, a fucking memory of my dad rather than a ghost of my dad. But sure, I think more or less phenomenologically it's pretty similar, right? But what is that? I mean, that is an information pattern in my brain that was kind of caused by the interactions inside my relationship with my dad over all the years I had that relationship with him, right? There's an imprint or an impression in my neurology that is fucking dad, right? And it's deep in there, and it's never going to go. And in fact, it forms part of who I am, right? Like, in a way, to some degree, it forms part of who I am. But what is that? Well, it's like, we could think of these as kind of like information patterns of, and this is kind of getting into the nature of the self and where it actually exists. I mean, like, in a way, I could say, Max, you have a little inner Porcelli in your mind, and I have an inner Max in my mind. And what does that mean? I don't know. It's from a computer science way, it's like a data structure, right? There's an information imprint or something in here that's built out of these ways we signal back and forth.
Yeah, they get tagged with metadata maxness or something like that,
Yeah. So in the sense that there might be something that is seemingly supernatural or woo, it's this idea, and this kind of gets to that hardware software thing that Hofstadter and Dennett like to do, where it's like, well, can you peel off the information layer, right? It's a little bit, can I look at that, video file on a Mac OS or on a Windows PC? Either one, right? On an Android, or like, you're sort of saying like that information is essentially portable and coherent in itself in a way that is substrate independent, right? The only way to experience that is through a physical substrate, but it can appear inside of multiple physical substrates, right? The video file,
and that would corrupt the file, I think. Okay, so If there's some,
But it doesn't corrupt. What I'm saying, the internet makes it so it doesn't corrupt it. It stays the same.
oh, see, oh gosh, how much time do we have? Do we get to talk about neural uploads?
Yeah, let's do it right now. But I mean, do you see what I'm saying about the? Yeah, let's get there. Go for it.
Yeah.
The fucking video file can be interpreted by different hardware.
That's it, right.
Still
it's
appear like the
reinterpreted
same video.
though, and that's going to change its
Sure.
phenomenological character, I believe.
Not to the viewer, it doesn't.
Okay, so so interestingly, right? Check it out. Okay, so first of all, I just want to tell you that I have. I don't want to say my dad died too, but it's just so weird that you said that, because I have had these same experiences, almost like a religious person talking to God. I talk to my dad all the time in my mind, and I hear his voice, and I talk to him much more than when he was living. In fact, I avoided calling him on the phone because he got on my damn nerves, you know. but now it's almost like I have this selective editing process where I get to channel that dad module, and I imagine it being, you know, like, okay, he's gone up and gone to heaven, and now there's a certain level of understanding and wisdom that he has. So I'm idealizing my dad now as I talk to him, and giving him this level of understanding and patience that he didn't have in real life. And now it's almost like this is how I'm processing my dad's death. But anyway, I just wanted to tell you that, because same kind of shit, weird. Okay, somebody needs to unpack that. I want to look into that more offline. But on the question of where we were going with all this stuff about, you know, emulation, like Robert Hanson's idea that you could, or San Junipero episode of Black Mirror, where you have these, you can take these, you know, I just want to assume, first of all, that these servers they have, that this is not pure code, because I don't think that there's a one-to-one relationship that could be causally, because to me, I'm a physicalist functionalist. I think you have to represent faithfully the causal physical processes that extend all the way outward to a very far degree. I don't know how far those extend, but pretty damn far, right? So if you have this experience, this what we've been calling the experiential layer, and it is represented through causal physical means, instantiated in some medium. I don't see the instantiation medium being a microprocessor, although I suppose it could be. But whatever the instantiation medium is, it must faithfully represent the causal physical processes. I just don't think it's plausible to think that software code can do that. Okay. All right. I think that you have to have
fight you on this
that it's
one.
got to be more neuromorphic, at least for replicating human consciousness. And whether that turns out to be microtubules or what the fuck ever, that once you are able to do that, you might have some kind of ability to instantiate consciousness and phenomenal properties in another medium that isn't that isn't just like a human. It could be silicon based or whatever, but that entity will have those what it's like qualities that you and I have when we're speaking to each other and experiencing each other right now. Okay, so I believe that that's not only possible but probable in the future. But I do want to push back on this idea of thinking of mapping our neurophysiology as code and uploading it, unless what that does is reactivate an instantiation medium that is capable of rendering the causal physical processes exactly.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, there's a way I will agree with you, and I think I will disagree with you. But I want to just rewind to where we were, because we were leaving off on like the woo part. This is where I get a little bit woo.
Okay.
Is if I think of just information as a kind of a quasi supernatural substance, right? I don't think of it as supernatural, but like there is a way that if you sort of like look at information theory in its purest form, or math in its purest form, right? It's like, whatever it is, like if you're a math Platonist or whatever your philosophy of math is, like whatever the fuck that shit is like, it's like pattern per se, right? That's what it is. It's just patterns independent of any physical instantiation, right? Like that's sort of like what they are in our mind, and we imagine them. And this is a little bit why the Pythagoreans hated irrational numbers. They were like, those can't be real. Those irrational numbers cannot be real because they can't be physically instantiated. But maybe an irrational number is a little bit like is actually a placeholder for an algorithm that just says like, give me this many digits of that irrational number, and you get as many as you're going to get. But in order to get any meaningful usage of like an irrational number in the physical world, right, you have to instantiate it somehow, which means it's like, I'm going to represent pi to 150 decimal places for this thing, but I can't represent it to an infinite amount of decimal places because that would suck up all the energy in the whole universe for all eternity until the heat death of the universe, and we still wouldn't get to the end of it, right? So there's a sort of way that I think that it kind of puts an upper limit on the spiritual nature, I suppose, of math. But I sort of said the closest thing we've got to something like this is this world of information and math, because we can do it all kinds of places in all kinds of ways.
This is where you will lose me. Okay,
it's woo though.
It seems woo to me because I just don't get it. I've never, when you talk about postulating mathematical entities and things like that, mathematicians are so fluent and so conversant in this stuff, and I'm terrible at math, but that's not the same as having some sort of philosophical insight about maths. Right. I wonder if my lack of mathematics training means that I haven't been able to fully appreciate or apprehend those kinds of insights, like the nature of mathematical entities of certain sorts that they have in nature. Are they real? Those kind of philosophy maths questions.
Sure.
But I understand why you think that this could be related to the question of consciousness.
Yes. So let's just set aside, like, I'll just say, I'm not a math Platonist. I don't think that there are some quasi-actual spiritual math entities in some Platonic realm. I actually think they have to be physically instantiated, which brings me back to naturalism.
But
right?
What is the thing that is being instantiated?
The thing that's being instantiated is a pattern.
Right. So,
which is where it gets kind of woo. It gets kind of woo.
Right. Pattern is a set of relational properties. Is that what information is?
Yes. So you're kind of getting to my favorite thing. Like there's in the history of Western philosophy, there's this idea of like, what is an inherent attribute to an object versus what is a kind of like relational attribute that it has to other objects or entities, right? It's the idea of essentialism versus relationalism. And there's some people in Western philosophy who sort of believe that there are essential properties that inhere into an object or an entity that make it what it is. If you go over to the Buddhism world, or you go to the relational kind of philosophical point of view in the Western philosophy, you just say, there are no intrinsic properties. There are no essences. Nothing exists besides a thing in the relations to the other things. It's the idea of like Indra's web or something like this, right? Like it's called interdependent co-origination. And it's actually a doctrine in philosophy, in Buddhism.
It strikes me that this line of thinking could inform the kind of simulation, Berkeley idealism stuff that's out there too. It reconciles this hard distinction between information and relational properties on the one hand, and causally efficacious entities or physical stuff on the other, because it's energetic.
Right.
What is energy? Energy is also a set of relationships. Yes. All the way down, it is just information.
All the way down.
Yeah.
All the way down. And you could even say, our scientific theories is sort of like, this is a philosophy of physics question. It's like, are there really quarks down there, or are those just fucking terms in an equation that represent a relation between things? And it's like, it's a quasi-realism or a quasi-non-realism to what is the nature of the physics equations, right? And like at this level, I'm just like, yeah, I think they are relational. I just think it is like we interacted with the universe over this long history of humanity. We wrote it down in our books, and we did this sort of thing, and we've come up with these concepts, and these concepts are information patterns that describe some kind of, if you do these actions or carry out this experiment, you would get these results under these conditions. And that's it, right? There's not an actual little physics engine way down there, sort of, that's a real thing generating something, right? Like it's not really there. It's just probing the relational nature of reality all the way down one more layer,
Mm-hmm.
this is where it gets woo to me, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, it all has to be ultimately physically instantiated, which is the naturalism side. But whatever it is that it is, whatever representation that it is, the math equations that Newton wrote down with his pen, right? It's in some kind of physical substrate, and it always has to be on a physical or a naturalistic substrate, including the consciousness.
And this is why we're always speaking about different levels of description. So it's not merely the levels of complexity. It's also the levels of description for whatever the phenomenon is in question. And
yes,
this harkens to intertheoretic reduction, but is not intertheoretic reduction. It is in the properties of complexity theory, or in better even perhaps integral theory of Ken Wilber, talking about the relationships between wholes and parts, but also extending that rationale or extending that feeling and rationale down to the kinds of things that Heisenberg would have appreciated, which is the spooky action phenomena of the universe being at some level relational properties, informational properties, and starting to think of things so far outside of the matrix of Newtonian objects or heat or radiation or these things that are one level of description that at another level of description and at another scale are more like the words relational properties keep coming into my mind, but what would be a good example of that would just be I don't know. I'm the words fail me. Its nature is of of something more like. I'm sorry, I can't do it. It stumps me.
Yeah.
But I feel like I intuitively am picking up what you're giving me.
Yeah. I mean, Buddhism calls it emptiness sometimes, right? It's like all entities are devoid of intrinsic essence. Is just fundamental. They only exist in relation with each other. They only have any perceptibility in relation to other things, which makes sense, right? This actually kind of brings the consciousness full circle, right? It's like, I don't know there's a max unless I'm seeing the max come through my portal, right? Like, or my window, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's the interaction that gives rise to even the thought pattern that there is an entity out there or an object out there, or that it has properties at all, right? It's like the dialogue that we're carrying out, or it's like the probing of the world with our instruments of scientific discovery. And then now let's take this all the way to where we left off with the simulation,
well, and it's,
right?
It's quick, just really quickly before we close on that, because we should close. And I don't want to.
We do.
I don't want to because I love this shit.
It's fun.
But the idea in philosophy of science about unobservable entities, right? Unobservable entities really push back against this Baconian empiricism, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like you have to theorize them in order to know them.
Yes.
Which inverts the process of in the philosophy of science in most ways. Right. So, look, it's always, hypothesis, test the hypothesis and so on. But with unobservable entities, or at least as yet unobserved entities, you have to almost like have layers of inference that, let's see how to explain that. You have to have a certain level of inference machines that are the sort of causal matrix of what happens in proximity to those entities in order to be able to even indicate or ostensibly somehow postulate their existence.
Yes.
Yeah. And then what gets tested are these kind of inference systems.
Yes.
It's a very strange, disconnected way of doing science, but something like that's got to happen with consciousness too.
This is what's happened with science. Like, the instruments themselves are built out of theory, right? This concept in philosophy of science that observation is theory laden intrinsically.
Yes.
It does break down whatever we want to call like the orange meme modernist conceit about what the fuck we were doing when we were doing science, the Baconian. It's just not that what correspondence theory of truth and we're just observing a thing. Just no, we never are. Our eyeballs are theory laden because there's a whole science of optics that makes our eyeballs work. But we didn't know that when we started doing science 500 years ago or whatever it was. We were just looking at things, right? But then we like did so much science that we like went like, whoa, our eyes are actually only perceiving this amount of light. They're not perceiving all of the light, right? And like we're building these instruments and like, what the fuck is those little traces of those lines that you get? Like, this is the particle accelerator that smashed these things together. Are those lines like what the particles did? And you're like, kind of, but you're actually talking about like many, many layers of an instrument that has a tiny little mini physical response. And it's just, right, like in these detectors inside of a tube, and they are all wired up to another thing. And then somebody goes, let's make a graphical representation of that. And they go like, oh, that's a graphical representation of whatever that fuck that was. Okay, what is that? Like, are you looking at what it did? No, the instrument is itself many layers of theoretical construct in, like you said, in proximity to the phenomenon.
Yes. Yeah. And it's almost like we have to deal with a series of nested theories in order for science to progress in these domains. So it's almost like the mathematicians and the physics theorists, that theory becomes the science almost, as long as the matrices of inference continue to hold up.
Exactly.
That's the only way to do science at that point. And now we're turning the lenses of observation and theory formation on the very mediums that we use to do that science. And we're coming up we're coming up with difficult mysteries that collapse into some sort of self-referential loops of a fractal sort that seem to just assuage the sense of mystery or deepen it in some ways, that change it, morph it, make it a different kind of mystery than the mind-body problem.
Yes. It's weird shit. So, I mean, so the simulation thing, like on the one hand, I could say, hey, there's a video file, right? You could look at it on your Android, your iPhone, your iPad, your desktop, a Windows desktop, whatever. And the video file faithfully like gets decoded by a completely different screen and a different set of hardware and a different operating system, but it looks like the same video file. Like this audio file is being deployed, across all kinds of devices when people are listening to us, right? That's kind of cool because you can create like a hard barrier, right? This is actually a computer science, it's operating systems theory. You can create like, multi-layered hierarchical systems structures where you can kind of like create a layer, which essentially allows, an emulation of another thing to appear. We actually call it emulation in computer science. Like, oh, you're just emulating the codec for that particular type of file on your operating system for your hardware. And the drivers take care of like making sure the little photons go to your eyes so it looks the same, or, vibrations go to your ear so it looks the same. That's pretty cool, right? That is that woo information theory. Like this audio file is a hyperobject, right? It's like we're talking and it exists here on our computers, but then we're going to like produce it and copy it and upload it. And it's going to, what is it? It's like this thing that sort of exists in many different times and places.
If that sort of, if there's some sort of way of moving between and among levels of description and faithfully representing the relational properties in some information set, we can start to have really interesting experiences, could have interesting experiences across subjectivities. And that's it.
We already kind of do, right? We already kind of do a little bit just through talking.
Yeah, they're mediated through language, through fucking Zoom and all this
signaling
stuff. Like, could you take some sort of layer of that information layer, and even if you put the experience in the instantiation medium that is different from a wetware standpoint of my brain versus yours, like maybe right here where the brainstem interacts with with all these other processes, you're able to intercept that in some way, and provide me with a sort of subjective experiences of Porcelli on another day, even though
Yes.
that experience is going to be filtered through my own set of beliefs and circumstances and otherwise, it still gives me pretty special insight into, well, anyway, that's going off the reservation. I want to bring.
You want to land the plane?
I think we got to land the plane. Otherwise, we'll keep going for ages.
Okay.
But
let me bring in one. I do want to land the plane with you, but there's something you just said there in this last piece. So I got to bring in kind of the thing that I do for a living, right? I facilitate intersubjective communication processes. Some of these are actually very, very deep processes, like we actually call the thing called the circling method, intersubjective meditation. But what do? We sit in a circle and we talk, but we don't just talk. We feel our bodies. There's actually a whole training you can do to like get yourself better at this thing.
Yeah.
But I do believe that there's, all the information transfer we're talking about, the signaling systems. I don't think it's a woo thing. I think there's actually a lot of subtle, like body temperature or pheromones emanating from your skin, or tiny little ways you're noticing other people glance with the whites of their eyes or whatever. You see their heart beating in their, in their carotid artery in their neck or something, like whatever it is, or they're breathing deeper. Oh my gosh. Like you can kind of like train yourself to be like, we are here together exchanging words, but also observations, and we're feeling our bodies and our sensations almost like in a meditative state, but in a communicative meditation, not in an internal introspective meditation. But I can tell you that sometimes in those moments, really weird shit happens where somebody will go like, you know what this reminds me of? And they'll be like, blah, blah, blah. And the person over there is like, I was thinking the exact same thought. So like, are we actually sharing a subjectivity? I don't really know. But what you can do is I think you can create a kind of nexus causality. If you sync up enough signals of communication with a group of people or a pair of people or something, you can start to have something that's probably the closest thing that I know of to a shared subjectivity.
Interesting. Well, you have persuaded me. At some point, I'm going to have to pop my cherry and do some sort of circling exercise to have that experience, because I can totally imagine. I was going to write a story one time about this guy who invents the ability to email thoughts, and how then how the people start to get in the room and have these sort of feedback experiences that cause us this this overbrain experience. It sounds very similar to that, and that you do this for a living to get people to bond and understand each other better is pretty fascinating stuff. So I need to confer my trust into your hands at some point and try it out. But man, what an episode today. I'm just, we get riffing like this and you realize this is going to be a record for the length of an episode. Fuck it, right?
I think so. I think it might be. Yeah, it's great. Awesome, dude. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another episode, an exciting episode on consciousness here on Social Evolution. And we will see you again, or talk to you again some other time in the future, in the near future.
Adios, muchachos.